The potential fragility of the system are perhaps more embedded if you studied a period when that fragility was more evident. And then also, I think where you are writing from makes a difference too. And this is, where I have to come clean. I am a white European male, and I think that gives me a very distinctive view on Chinese politics and international relations. I spend a lot of my time in China working with the Chinese collaborators and colleagues. And this perhaps explains why I spend a lot of the book looking at Chinese debates and discourses and trying to understand Chinese perspectives on China's rise. But I spend more time in the UK and up until recently in Europe, the rest of Europe. Wish we were still there. I ran a big European Union project and was in Brussels a couple of times a month. And I also spend quite a lot of time advising policymakers, now primarily in the UK. And in the UK and in Europe, questions are being asked about China, and I think basic perceptions about the consequences and benefits of China's rise that are somewhat different to the questions and perceptions in other parts of the world. So I'll put my hand straight up and say this is very much a European perspective, a perspective that reflects perhaps the dominant discourse of China in Europe, and I have to accept that isn't the same discourse that there is around the world and the dominant way that China has been thought of in different countries. So these different perspectives are the first part. The second part I've already hinted at. I spent a lot of time in China. When I was writing this book, I was lucky enough to be a visiting professor at the Foreign Affairs University, which is the Foreign Ministry University. And then in 2018 at Fudan University in Shanghai, which in fact, in the past 5 years, I've been on the Fudan University campus more often than Warwick University's own campus, actually. And it is really quite incredible. A couple of things really quite notable, I think, that the very different basic understanding starting point from the inside out and the outside in. That the idea of a defensive and reactive and responsive China as a latecomer to global power status, if you like, trying to navigate its way in a hostile international environment that isn't conducive to China's rise, is very much embedded in the minds of most of the academics and policy makers and think tankers that you come into contact with in China. And I think certainly in Europe that is either not widely understood or dismissed as sophistry and hiding behind a guise of defensivism for some sort of aggressive purpose. And how you try and create some sort of dialogue between two fundamentally different ways of thinking about the nature of China actually has been something that I've tried to do, and something that increasingly concerns me, not least with the things that have happened in the last couple of weeks, suggesting that the possibility of trying to find common ground for understanding the basic starting point of China's rise might be very difficult. Then the third motivation was I kept hearing people talking about Chinese power and China as a global power, which seems to make instinctive sense, right? But I thought, well, what are these sources of power? Where is this power derived from? A lot of people talk about China's soft power, but most of the people around here that talk about Chinese soft power then complain about Confucius Institutes and Chinese television and Chinese media. It didn't seem to be very powerful as far as I could see. It didn't seem to be bringing about the change that China's leaders seem to want it to bring. So I began to think about the different dimensions of Chinese power, and not just thinking about economic power, but then breaking that down between productive power, financial power, technological power, and trying to think, really where does this power emerge from? And then the fourth and final motivation was that things have changed a lot. I was trying to remember when my last book actually came out. I think it was 2007 because they reprinted it, but certainly before the global financial crisis. And any Chinese language article you read about China's place in the world will have a special mention for the global financial crisis, because there is this perception in China that this marked a key moment, not the end of American dominance, but the beginning of the end, if you like, of American ability to rule the world as America seems fit. And I think there's a feeling in China that some global asymmetries flipped during that financial crisis. For example, between Europe and China. China goes into the financial crisis in a sort of inferior position, but comes out of it in a superior position. Superior in terms of having survived a crisis that those who created the crisis didn't survive very well, and also with more confidence in the Chinese political economy as being robust and able to respond to crises when they came along better than more neoliberal systems of political economy. The growth of outward financial flows from China was still in its relative infancy in 2007, with most Chinese investment going to other developing countries seeking resources, and that changed dramatically in the 2010s. And then, of course, there was this slight issue of Xi Jinping becoming China's new leader in 2012 and 13, and the changes that he seems to have brought about. And these all suggested to me that it was time that I didn't keep harking back to something that I'd written in 2000, whenever it was, and published in 2007, but time to do something different. But of course, as you're going along, because books take a while to write, I don't know whether you can hear that dog barking next door, hopefully not. As you begin to write, things change. Obviously, the pandemic was one of the things that changed. I was just about to send the book to the publisher when it became clear that I couldn't send a book to the publisher without any mention of the pandemic. So that delayed it while I waited a little bit longer to see if I could add anything. And as it happens, I think the pandemic doesn't fundamentally change anything. I think the pandemic has acted as a magnifying glass. It's not a microscope. So it's not something we use to try and find something that we think might be there that we haven't seen before. It's a magnifying glass because it makes what we already thought we knew was there look bigger and closer and more imminent. So I think the pandemic has been an accelerator, or it's concentrated pre-existing thinking and trends. So that had to go in. But also, I mean, particularly in the UK, but in Europe in general, and of course in the United States, and I've already mentioned Australia, that by the time I finished the first draft of the book, perceptions of China had turned much more negative in this part of the world, at least, than they had when I started writing the book. I hate to use the word the West because it aggregates lots of people with different ideas together into a single thing. As I said once at a conference in China, which West do you want, the West of Hayek or the West of Marx? I mean, it's not exactly the same way of thinking, but for shorthand, I will refer to it the West, that there had been a hardening of thinking. There had been an increasing consensus that the consequences of China's rise had probably more negatives than benefits for the West, or at least now as many benefits from the West. And this was particularly noticeable in the UK, because it's not that long ago that George Osborne and David Cameron were desperately trying to become China's best friends in Europe, touting a golden age of relations. And yet now we have Boris Johnson claiming that he's a Sinophile, but the UK Integrated Review clearly stating that China is seen as a systemic challenge and a systemic rival. So in a relatively short period of time, we'd seen I think quite significant shift, and I wanted to ask, well, what is it that's brought around that shift in perceptions? And then another thing that happened, and this is what I'm going to focus on now for a few minutes, is that interesting questions were being asked about the nature of Chinese grand strategy and whether China had a grand strategy or not. And that actually really captured my imagination to the extent that I devoted a chapter to this in the book in the end. Now, why did I bother? It might seem so obvious that China has a grand strategy that it doesn't need sort of stating. Well, a few years ago, done some research on Chinese writings on whether China had a grand strategy itself. And there were surprisingly few that actually spoke about Chinese grand strategy. And the ones that did, there was pretty much a consensus that China didn't have one. That there was nothing that you could discernibly say was the Chinese grand strategy at all. Now, I was a bit surprised by this and asked around, and some IR specialists, particularly in Beijing, said it's because grand strategies are what hegemons have. Grand strategies associated with the United States and a hegemonic plot. And because China will never be hegemonic, we're not going to act in the same way that other great powers acted in the past. There was a reluctance to talk in terms of the language of grand strategy, because it makes it sound like you've got, well, a strategy. There's an aim to sort of bring around change in the world. And there was a reluctance to say that China actually had that, and an insistence, in fact, that China was never going to be hegemonic, therefore it didn't have one. The second thing, which I thought was really quite interesting, was up until about 2000 and I would say 11, 12, even maybe 13, there was as many people, researchers in China, saying that China was still not a global power, still not a great power, and still weak than there were people claiming that, or assigning China great power status. There was quite a strong argument that China's power capabilities had been over-exaggerated by people who got too excited by the global financial crisis, that China was still relatively poor in per capita terms, that it had myriad domestic issues to deal with, not least the environment, but inequality and poverty, and that the idea of China having the capability to actually enforce its will on a global stage was just fanciful. And as I say, there was quite a large body, but I would say the majority feeling was that China didn't really have the ability to do too much up until the last decade. And a third reason was that there was such a fragmentation of power and interest within the policy-making process that it was almost impossible to have a single strategy, because China had maybe 20, 30, 40 different strategies, depending on which ministry, which agency, what province you were looking at any one time. And the story was that China, particularly under Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, had become sort of captured and trapped by a range of different interests that were preventing it from developing a clear and coherent way forward. I sat down with a professor, I won't say their name because I haven't had their permission, in Beijing in 2011, and he got we were in a cafe and he got loads of little biscuits and things out, and that was the military, and that was the Ministry of Finance, and this was the central bank, and showed how all these different things, and then brought in the provinces, and basically argued that the central leadership would be some sort of captured and unable to move, unable to be decisive and push through on key areas. And indeed, it seems that Xi Jinping probably shared this view, because that might well explain why he's done some of the things that he's done since 2012 to consolidate the party's control over society, and indeed to consolidate his control over the party. But anyway, even though from about the invasion of Iraq onwards, there had been an identification of what the Chinese called a moment of strategic opportunity, as the West seemed to become fractured between the US and some of its allies. Up until relatively recently, there was not really an identification of a strategy. Now, some people would say that keeping a low profile, Taoguangyanghui, became a strategy in itself, that China's strategy was not to have a strategy, or not to have a clearly observable or identifiable strategy. But what we see, beginning from the global financial crisis, is a recognition of significant power changes. I think the moment that the EU delegation went to China to try and get help for the euro bailout might have been a key moment in that, actually. And there is now an acceptance of China's great power status. As I say, this might not sound radical, but actually, if you follow the trajectory, the genealogy, we don't have to be Foucauldian to talk about genealogies of scholarship, I don't think, of Chinese thinking and debating its own place in the world. It's only relatively recently that this great power status has actually been accepted and asserted. Okay, not perhaps as great as the greatest of the great powers still, and there is a power difference between them. and China should only be expected to do things commensurate with its, shall we call it, lesser great power status. But nevertheless, the idea that China now is self-identified as a great power, and Chinese leaders think that there is the ability and capability to push ahead with things, is significantly different. And within China itself, not surprisingly, great emphasis is placed on Xi Jinping himself. His reflection on China's comprehensive national power, his strategic thinking, the way that he's gone back to Chinese history and to Marxism to develop a new sort of blended Chinese Marxism that provides the theoretical basis for China's global action, but also the more practical things that he's done in creating, for example, a National Security Commission and placing himself at the head of it, which gives the authority of a single person or single body, at least, to be able to pull in these different interests and, I was going to say find compromise, but I think more often impose one position as being the national position over others. And there's also a range of ad hoc central working groups that he's either taken direct control of or his close allies have taken control of. So there's been a consolidation of this power in a way that's made it possible, if you read the Chinese scholarship, for the first time to align both domestic and international policy and strategy together to create a single strategic objective. So that's one reason that I was very interested in grand strategy, because it shows it's a good case study of the evolution of thinking about China's own place in the world within Chinese scholarship. But another one is that in certainly within European scholarship, and I think to an extent in America as well, it's led to this really interesting debate over what we mean by grand strategy, and highlights some of the key divisions over the way that China's being looked at. So on the one hand, is this idea of grand strategy meaning that pretty much everything that is done by Chinese international actors overseas is at the direct guidance and behest of the central leadership. You know, the idea that Xi Jinping sits in Zhongnanhai and clicks his fingers and a company from Anhui province invests in Malaysia, or that everything that happens is part of this clearly coordinated, directed plan and strategy with clear intent and consequences. On the other side of that, there are a range of scholars, and mostly people who study China from the inside out, who say, well, no, hold on a second, that you're missing the incredible diversity of these, different provinces, and below the provinces, the prefectures and the counties that have their own objectives and their own goals. Most Chinese overseas investment is not carried out anymore by the large state-owned enterprises at the centre. Most of it's by private ones or locally owned enterprises, for example, at the county and township level. You can't even get agreement between the People's Bank in China and the Ministry of Finance over renminbi internationalization, for example. So to think of all this as being clearly coordinated and orchestrated leads to some very strange understandings. And it also leads to evidence being taken of Chinese intent when it might actually be evidence of something else instead. And I think that the great example of this is if you think about the debate over China's debt trap diplomacy. Well, if you believe in the debt trap theory, then you have to believe that Chinese companies deliberately go out to lend money to projects that they know will fail, that they know won't repay back the capital, and therefore be able to use it for political leverage. And the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka is the one that's always used as evidence of this, not least because it was the one that was first raised by Cheleni. But if you look at what's happening in China, the argument there is that we are wasting money, we're losing money through irrational or perhaps rational exuberance. People have jumped on board the Belt and Road project. They've invested in things without really thinking them through. They've got money too easily from the banks. They've invested in projects that don't work. And when they fail, what tends to happen is that the repayments are renegotiated. And in most cases, the Chinese side either doesn't get as much as it thought it was going to get, or in a number of cases have had to write off the debt. So whereas the debt trap hypothesis sees intent and, if you like, cunning and wisdom, the people who look more from a domestic politics perspective are seeing errors. they're seeing mistakes, they're seeing problems, they're seeing money being wasted and problems that need to be rectified. And actually what's happened on the Belt and Road in recent years is we've seen a pulling back from that first stage of exuberance, as now there is an emphasis on what is called quality Belt and Road. So it might still have the same consequences of debt, but the intent or the assumed intent tells us something that perhaps we want to hear rather than always what is the reality. And it means that I think on many occasions evidence of intent has been assumed when it was really something else that was driving Chinese policy. So my position is something of a hybrid between the two. I mean, I think, yes, there is a clear set of objectives established by Xi Jinping and the central leadership, and there is a clear idea of how these might be attained. And much clearer now than was in the pre-Xi Jinping era. And some of these have been very highly publicized and promoted, like the Belt and Road. And with changes in the distribution of power in the global order, I think there's a much clearer conception now in China of how the Chinese leadership might go about getting the things that they want in terms of global change. But that does not mean that everything that is done by Chinese international actors overseas directly is a result of this strategy or directly contributes to it. And the problem is working out who is doing what for which reasons a lot of the time. And the expansion of Chinese overseas direct investment is a really good example of this. I mean, what happens is you often get policy capture. Now people often refer to sort of the state capture, but I mean policy capture by other actors. So what happens often in China is that a strategy is announced. Let's say, China must defend its core interests. We must defend our core interests. We must have a set of core interests that we must resolutely defend and never negotiate on. But what these core interests are and how far they can be extended is never clearly defined. So then what happens is lots of actors will say, what I do is core interest, and try and capture any of the benefits that might be going around of this strategic change. So people want what they're doing, the production of this pen is core interest. Therefore, I must get all the protection provided by the state in the protection of this. And so there is then this competition to define or interpret or implement these central directives in ways that fit either local interests or commercial interests. The Belt and Road is a classic example because the Belt and Road started life as a plan to help boost the Western development, the development of the Western parts of China. But even before it came into existence, the provinces in the interior and the northeast wanted a bit of the pie as well, and it became expanded into what became the Belt and Road even before it was announced. And once it was announced, then we see intense competition for different parts of the country to identify themselves as key Belt and Road centres, and a number of companies to identify what they probably would have already done anyway as being a Belt and Road project to then get advantage from the insurance guarantees and lower cost finance that are provided for Belt and Road projects. So the strategy is there, but then the strategy sort of gets pulled and pushed and prodded and expanded and changed as a variety of actors try and utilize them for their own either local or perhaps commercial aim. The best example, I think, is the expansion of foreign investment in the 2000s. Not all of this happened because the state wanted it to happen. The state wanted to liberalize its investment regime so Chinese companies could go out, buy technology, access new markets. They wanted to go beyond that first wave of investment of investing in resources. Couldn't have happened without the state loosening its controls, allowing finance to move, and actually facilitating money going out of the country to other parts of the world. But then when it did in 2016-17, the state had to step in and reimpose some of its controls on financial flows and foreign direct investment, because people had taken advantage of those new freedoms and gone off and invested in places that the state didn't really want them to invest. Real estate and in the media and in the entertainment industry in the United States, for example. So this shows both the power of the state at both ends in initiating and being able to control, but also the partial weakness of the state, because once it lets things go, it finds it very difficult to control them. So if in 2016 you had looked at an investment by a Chinese company in, let's say, a media operation in America and said, this is an example of China's state strategy, they're trying to do this, you would have been entirely wrong. Because actually, 2 years later, ex post facto, we know that the Chinese state didn't want that to happen. Where am I going with this? So I think this is really interesting, because when we talk about economic statecraft, normally we're talking about economic means being used to produce political or foreign policy objectives. But in the Chinese case, I think there's been an extension of the concept of economic statecraft, and I wonder whether it makes it a very useful concept. In China, sometimes when things are being done for commercial ends, this is also seen as being political. Now, really, the study of foreign investment shouldn't be done by people like me. This should be left to the very good people who do business management, management studies, and so on and so forth. But foreign direct investment has become a key topic for international relations specialists, particularly looking at China-Europe relations in recent years. It's not because of these investments are seen as being a direct political issue, although in some cases, obviously, they are. Huawei being an obvious case in point. The Hinkley Point nuclear power station in the UK is the case. But actually, these big issues are the exceptions rather than the rule. Most of the time, these investments are being undertaken by local governments or by private companies for commercial reasons and objectives. And yet that is seen as being political because they're seen as an interim means to a greater end of increasing the wealth and power of China. And this is broadly seen as a bad and dangerous thing within Europe. So a businessman or businesswoman, let's say from Anhui, can in their mind go out and undertake an entirely commercial project by, let's say, buying a distribution unit in Portugal, solely for commercial reasons. But this is passed and understood by policymakers in Europe as being inherently political because the consequences that this might have for the Chinese economy as a whole, the idea that this is seen as building a strong and powerful China, and the further idea that this strong and powerful China is not going to do things in the future that are beneficial to Europe. So what this means, I think, is that it's very difficult to pass. As China's international economic interactions become more extensive, both in terms of where they are and the amount of them, although the investment has dropped off in the last couple of years, this automatic assumption that what is being done at the direct control and behest of the state, or directly leads to gains for the state which are good or dangerous, is one of the key reasons, I think, why perceptions of China have changed significantly, at least in the part of the world that I'm talking from, if not all parts of the world. So the nature and the speed of the growth of Chinese foreign direct investment into Europe and North America in the 2010s was, and this is really fascinating, right? So from 2010 up until it began to plateau off in 2016, Chinese investment into the United States was the fastest growing apart from Argentina, but the amount from Argentina was much less. So you see this period of rapid economic growth in the increase of Chinese investment into the US. At the end of this, how much of the total stock of overseas holdings in the United States was owned by Chinese companies? 1.4%. I mean, almost nothing. And if you look at European countries, it's the same. The common sense idea of the importance and significance of Chinese investment runs way ahead of the reality of the figures. It's very, very interesting. I mean, Japan and South Korea, and in certain years, India, are more important Asian investors into the United Kingdom than China. And the importance of North America, and in particular the rest of Europe, are even greater significant. And it's a shame that that wasn't said more often and more loudly, I think, during the Brexit debates. But let's move on from that. But if there is a misunderstanding of who is doing what for which reasons, then I think we have to look at the Chinese government itself and the way in which it's tried to position itself and market itself and signal its goals and intentions over the past few years. There was a period when you couldn't walk through the streets of London without falling over a Chinese think tank trying to explain what the Belt and Road was all about and the benefits of the Belt and Road. And I think the way that the Belt and Road has been disseminated and projected and promoted has actually not served China's strategic interests very well. It's acted to raise those concerns that much of Chinese diplomacy previously had been trying to offset. So I don't want to make it sound like it's all the mistake of people who are looking at China to make these assumptions. I think the way the Chinese state's projected itself has importance too. So I've not left much time to say actually what the strategy is about. Well, there's not, can't go into it in any great detail anyway. I think, some of the strategy is just doing things that great powers do. Great power has big strategies. A great power provides global public goods. A great power has soft power. And I think that's some of the driver behind the way that the Belt and Road's been announced and projected in the way that it has been. And also because of the way that the Chinese government's gone about projecting or trying to project its soft power. The strategy is also about changing the benchmark of success against which CCP rules should be evaluated at home. So it's no longer just performance equals GDP growth. Actually, the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation and returning China to the top table of global politics is an important dimension of this. And one of the first things Xi Jinping did when he was leader is he went to the Rejuvenation of China exhibition at the museum in the square. And this has been part of the zeitgeist of his rule, that the CCP and his CCP are restoring China to its rightful place as a global power with global ambitions, with global strategies, with new institutions, the whole range of things. And I think we shouldn't underestimate that at all. In providing China solutions to the world for global governance, this is partly about providing solutions to the world, but partly also about showing to the Chinese people that China is now in a position to do this. So it's a very important part of the domestic legitimacy of the CCP, I think. But most of all, I think it's about creating an autonomous developmental space. Now, what does that mean? I don't mean a geographic space, although actually accepting China's definition of its own sovereign borders is part of this, and creating new economic geographies is also part of it to guarantee Chinese supplies, for example, given concerns about how much passes through the Straits of Malacca. But I think it's more about creating an autonomous space where the Chinese leadership can do what the hell it wants within its own country, within its own borders, without let, hindrance, interference, or criticism from any outside sources. And part of this entails undermining the global power and authority of the existing powers too. So I think if we can use the language of the coronavirus, when it comes to challenging norms or challenging existing institutions, Chinese leaders are aware that they're not going to replace the Americans on the West or the liberal order anytime soon, but they can certainly undermine its claims to effectiveness, undermine its claims to authority, undermine its claim to legitimacy. In the language of the pandemic, I think they're trying to create herd immunity to Western liberalism as the benchmark for global ordering. And how do they do this? A whole range of ways: aid, investment, nation branding, projecting China's model of development in different ways, arguing for the change of the distribution of power in some institutions, building complementary institutions like the Investment Bank and the New Development Bank. And one of the things that I got very interested in this book was the 中国反安, which is translated normally as China Solutions, but it should be more like China Program, I think is a better solution. And the whole way in which there's an identity of China that is being constructed primarily for domestic purposes. built around what I call Occidentalism. So rather than saying clearly what China is, a sort of an essentialized version of the West is constructed that is negative. And then China is pitched and promoted as being the antithesis of this negative West. So you don't have to say what you are, you simply say what you're not. And actually, this is, can be quite powerful. It's China's not the only country in the world that doesn't like the imposition of supposed universal norms and principles. China's not the only country in the world that likes the way that the global order has been run and organized and dominated in recent years. And I think this process of Occidentalism serves a point up to an extent. I think at some point you have to start saying, okay, we'll do this instead. But it's very interesting. I mean, I don't know how far it's penetrated where you are, but what used to be called the Community of Common Destiny, but it is now being called the Community of Shared History for Humankind, is appearing in lots and lots and lots of documents, including now in the United Nations documents too, and resolutions. And so you dig and ask what it really is about. And it's really about a community of diversity. And it brings me back to my argument about an autonomous developmental space. Really, the Community of Common Destiny is saying we shouldn't have a global normative position. It's an anti-cosmopolitan position. It's about creating a world order where diversity is not only allowed and tolerated and accepted, but actually one that's encouraged. It might be for domestic use primarily, but it's one that I think can actually generate a considerable amount of followership, because in some respects it is a little bit empty. But the message of it, I think, is nevertheless quite powerful. And I'm not sure that many policymakers in the West have really sort of woken up to this. Anyway, what time is it? 1:45. I was going to say something about wolf warrior diplomacy and the recent spats between China and the EU and the UK and some of the ways in which this has been done. But I don't want to go on for too far. Maybe I'll just leave it at that. And just one final thing, though, that what I still find fascinating is that whether you're talking about domestic politics or international relations, or whether you're talking from a realist position or a liberal position, it's astonishing how much of the debate about China is still based on the future. It really is incredible. This, futurology is a fundamental part of any discussion about the role of China, and that includes within China itself. I mean, that makes it really impossible to win any argument, which in some respects makes it so interesting too. But it's incredible. I thought by now the debate would be on the realities of China as it is, and to a large extent it is, but it's still primarily about the future. So I wonder if China's main source of power is its imagined power. People are treating China today because of what they assume that it will be in the future. And in some cases that can be bad for China because it's an assumed bad China, but maybe in some cases it's good, because if that China is assumed to be even more big, even more powerful, and even more strong, then maybe people don't do things now because of what they expect it to be in the future. So I shall stop there and not bother with that last page, and we'll see if there's any questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Breslin. Now we are going to open for the students' questions, and I will follow the list that I was given. And the first one is Alexandre. Please, Alexandre, make your questions to Professor Breslin.
Well, thank you, Professor Breslin, for your seminar. It was very inspiring. And I would like to question you about the new parallel institutions that China is building around the world. For example, in relation to World Bank, China created the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. For global financial centers, in which the dollar is the dominant currency, China is establishing offshore centers for transactions with assets denominated in renminbi, the Chinese currency. Well, to what extent such initiatives may affect the global economic governance? Thank you, Professor. That is my question in this case.
Thanks for your comments and also your question. I mean, I will answer it, but it might not sound like I'm answering it at the beginning. I think what's fascinating about the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is that when it was first announced, you would have thought that Stalin had come back to life and been put in charge of the global economy, right? The stories were this was the end of the Western global economic system. China was fundamentally challenging and pulling apart the way the global order that was run. It's a bank, you know, it's an investment bank. It's not a guerrilla warfare training camp, you know, it's an investment bank. And the way that people responded to it, and actually, if you go back when the China Investment Corporation was established, people were saying, oh, this is the end, China will buy up the world, and this is the end of Western capitalism. And what happened? Actually, it spent most of its money domestically bailing out the Chinese banks. And I don't see the death of capitalism just yet, which makes me wonder whether some of the more apocalyptic assertions of the consequences of the Belt and Road should be taken with a pinch of salt. And let's come back in 5 years' time and see where we are with that. Now, on renminbi internationalization, so the investment bank, I think, has become a supplementary organization, if you like, you know, or complementary one. Not least because rather than alienate it and isolate it, most of the world decided to join it, and that had a clear influence, I think, on the way it was operated. Not everybody, of course, not the United States and not Japan, and I think quite interestingly, not the Republic, not Taiwan either, even though there was an attempt to join. It was, I think, rebuffed whether it got in later on. I don't think it did it? Maybe somebody knows better than me whether it did. So there's obviously politics there. But it's behaving in a way that you would expect an investment bank to. Nothing to worry about there. But in terms of the renminbi, what I think is interesting again is that I think there has been a lot of the same hype and concern about renminbi. Joining the SDR, for example, was one of them. Lots of talk about Zhou Xiaochuan in 2008, 2009 said maybe the dollar should be replaced as the dominant, as the global reserve currency. But if you strip out transactions across the Hong Kong-China border, the amount of international transactions that take place with the renminbi is roughly the same as the Malaysian ringgit, right? Because that cross-border transactions are so dominant in the way. Now, what this suggests is that the hype again has been over-exaggerated, but it doesn't mean that at some point it's not going to be significant. And I think we're still in the process of seeing a move towards the normalization, in my view, of the renminbi as a global currency, because basically too many policymakers don't want to give up the controls that would be necessary to give up if the renminbi was to become a truly global currency with enough countries around the world holding enough renminbi to make it a truly global currency. The reason that I say it doesn't necessarily mean that it won't be in the future is very interested in the digital renminbi. I don't know what will happen with that. But if my bet was on a renminbi challenge to the existing financial order, it wouldn't be on a traditional challenge in the way that people have spoken about it. As I say, I still think there's a long way to go before the renminbi becomes a normal currency in those ways. But it would, without any real concrete reason for saying this, I think because of perhaps the way in which there's been development of e-commerce within China, that the digital renminbi could be a game changer. But I, give a pinch of salt and remind myself that the apocalypse of the China Investment Corporation didn't happen, and the apocalypse of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank didn't happen, and I'm not sure the apocalypse of the Belt and Road will happen. But that would be where I think I would see it. I think that's the place to look, personally.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Please, Juan can make your question for Professor Breslin, please.
Hello, Professor. Thank you, first of all, for so enlightening lecture. I'm a master's student in international relations at the University of São Paulo, and I would like to ask you a question about the relation between the European Union and China. By the end of 2020, the European Union and China have reached a bilateral investment agreement, and was widely celebrated by both parties. But recently, the same European Union imposed sanctions over China due to alleged abuse in Xinjiang region. My question is, in your understanding, will the European Union going back to align with the Biden administration foreign policy toward China, or and put the investment agreement on hold, or is more likely that the European Union is setting its own strategic autonomy path and separating the politics from the economic issues? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a really interesting question. If I say, does the phrase "to have your cake and eat it," does that travel? Is that maybe like?
Sorry?
Yeah, there's a phrase in English, "to have your cake and eat it." It means that you want to do two things, right? Put it another way, it means you want to drink lots of beer and eat lots of chips, but still lose weight at the same time, right? That you're trying to do two things that might seem a little bit contradictory, and I think the European Union is trying to do a couple of things. I think it is trying to get closer to the US and Canada and Australia, and people actually in the Biden administration are calling it the Anglosphere, right? When it comes to issues of norms and principles and ideas, whilst maintaining a separate strategic identity, if you can call it that, when it comes to economic relations. However, you say that it was highly lauded. Actually, there are a lot of people in Europe very unhappy when that agreement was signed. Very, very unhappy. For both economic reasons, because they basically don't trust the Chinese authorities to liberalize the economy in the way that they've already said previously that we're going to liberalize the economy. And also for political reasons, because they thought that it was a mistake at a time when there were these tensions. And there was a lot of negative reaction. A lot of think tanks, European think tanks, were very, very negative about the agreement, and it still needs to be signed and ratified by the European Parliament, right? So there's a good possibility that it won't be. Not least because, yes, the EU sanctioned China, but China also sanctioned European citizens, right? Including MEPs. And if you look at the sanction, it says, including the places they work at and the institutions associated with them. So if you read that with a legal eye, it sort of says that the European Parliament itself has been sanctioned, the same European Parliament that is meant to be making that agreement. So this is a long way of saying, I don't know. It's really interesting. I wouldn't be at all surprised if the agreement wasn't approved, but then I wouldn't be surprised if it was too. And if you want to see, I think, a better example. So if you look at the European Commission document from 2019, it calls China a strategic competitor, a partner that we have to do business with, and an economic opportunity, something like that. It doesn't quite use those words. The UK integrated review that came out last week said China is a systemic challenge, but Boris Johnson called himself a Sinophile, and they want to do business with China. They want to do investment business with China. They want to do trade business with China. So I think all the sort of liberal democratic governments are facing to some extent the same question. How can we get all the good bits of China's rise without any of the bad bits? Right? It's quite simple when you say it like that. It's just quite hard when you actually try to do it. So as long as China is seen as creating more economic opportunities for Europeans than China is threatening or challenging the principles of the global order, then I think both the EU and also the UK separately will try and maintain this distinction and try and put economics off over here in this little box and then keep politics and society over here. But, not surprisingly, if you're looking at this from the other way, it sort of sounds like saying, you hate us and everything we stand for, but you want our money. So whether from the Chinese side out, this is going to be maintained. But it's back in the Cold War, if you were allied to the United States for security, you weren't going to be part of the Warsaw Pact for economics, right? The situation we're at today with China is the equivalent of, in those days, pointing guns over the border at the Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, whilst at the same time, huge amounts of money going both ways over the border in trade and investment too. We've not been in this position. People who are talking about return to the Cold War, I think they missed the point of the level of economic integration that is already taking place. Not so great in Europe, right? But Australia, a third of Australian exports go to China. You know, that's massive. So I think they will try and maintain the separation that you're talking about, but whether it's maintainable, I don't know. I mean, you've got parliamentarians here in the UK now been sanctioned by the Chinese state and researchers as well. But the UK is still keen on doing trade and investment with China at the same time. It's a very long-winded way of saying, 我不太清楚，我不知道。
谢谢。Thank you.
Thank you both. Esther, please, can you make your question?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Professor Shaun, for sharing your insights with us. I'm interested on Xi Jinping's discourse as a leader. And my question is, does this discourse of Xi Jinping go along with the reality of how China puts itself in global politics? As you mentioned, that not every Chinese actions follow a specific strategic per se. So his huge speeches are aimed at the domestic or international audience?
Thanks, Esther. I mean, the answer is a bit of both, right? I mean, it depends where he is and where he's talking. But you know, obviously, if you're in the United Nations, you know there's a global audience as well as a domestic one, and this is about signalling to the domestic population, but also signalling to the international order. And if we come back to the question that Alexander asked about the bank, for example, when you have the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, it's basically saying, if you don't reform yourself quick enough, we now have the will, the power, and the capability to do something else about it. We don't just have to wait for you to do it. So a lot of this signalling, I think, is real. So how can we put this? So in 2018, I was at a conference in Beijing with IR specialists, right? And I said I thought that the Belt and Road had been a strategic mistake. Not the investment on the Belt and Road. Actually, quite a lot of that had already been happening. The port in Pakistan precedes the announcement of the Belt and Road by 10 years, for example, even though it's a Belt and Road project. Not the investment itself, but I thought the way that Xi Jinping was selling China's intentions and selling China's power and selling China's strength was, if you like, overselling China's hands a little bit and more likely to raise suspicion than win support and friends. And all I can tell you is that there were about 25 people in the room. There was me and there was my good friend, the greatly missed Ian Taylor, who died recently, a specialist on China and Africa. And the rest of the audience were all Chinese. Every single person in the room nodded when I said that. They all went like that. You know, I think there's generally a feeling that, you know, maybe China does have the power, but to shout about it and to talk about it in that way is not necessarily strategically the right thing to do. And actually, most people think that it's creating, not most people, a number of people, put it that way, in China think that it's creating a number of hostilities to China all at the same time. So it's not just that you're getting pushback from Europe and from Australia and from America, but you're also getting pushback within the region itself, you know, within Southeast Asia, within Malaysia at times, and Philippines, depending on, you know, obviously leadership changes in those countries have led to different sort of opinions and so on and so forth. So I do. So I didn't talk about the wolf warrior diplomacy, but, you know, it perplexes me when Donald Trump is doing such a good job of making America look foolish in its response to the pandemic. Why does your foreign ministry spokesman need to go on the defensive and the aggressive defensiveness and suggesting that it was all Americans in the first place and they brought it to China and it escaped from an American lab? And why does the Chinese embassy in Paris have to put out French nurses are abandoning their hospitals and leaving their patients to die in their beds overnight and things like that. Why do they have to put a picture of mock up a cartoon of an Australian soldier killing an Afghanistan baby on the Foreign Ministry's Twitter webpage, Charlie Jian's webpage? I don't get it. So I asked my Chinese friends, and they say, "Oh, it's all for domestic purposes. It's all for domestic consumption." Even though a lot of it's on Twitter, right, which isn't available in China, they know that it'll, feed back into China. And if it is, I mean, I do wonder. A couple of years ago, Wang Yi, the foreign minister, said that the foreign ministry needed to basically, get stronger and be more aggressive and be more assertive. And maybe that's something to do with internal battles within the bureaucracy within China. But given that most people in China seem to already hold a certain position, all you're doing is increasing a marginal increase, perhaps, in what they think about the party defending China's interest, versus the cost of potentially alienating a lot of people at the same time by behaving in the way that they've done. Liu Xiaoming was the ambassador to the UK for a number of years, and he was often writing in the Financial Times or going on the BBC. He was given, free access. I would say that every time he was in the British media, he did more harm to China's standing and respect in the UK than convincing people that they were wrong and that nothing was happening in Xinjiang, for example. So I wonder whether some of it is an immaturity of being a great power, that China's not quite got used to the fact that it is a great power now. Comedians talk about the difference between punching up and punching down. So if you're punch up, if you make a joke about somebody who's more powerful than you, richer than you, it's funny. You can say things about people who are above you and it's funny. But if you make the same things about people who are down, you punch down, then it seems vindictive and nasty, and that you're sort of using your power in a different way. I wonder if we extend that, whether the speed of the power transition has taken people into surprise a little bit in China, and that they might think of themselves as punching up, whereas the rest of the world now, or a lot of the rest of the world, think that they're actually punching down. So it comes back to this defensiveness that I was talking about right at the beginning. From the inside, you feel you've got to punch up, and where from the outside, China's seen as rich and powerful, and it looks like being punched down upon. That's not a very good answer to your question, but I think I think his discourse has oversold China, and they could have invested every penny they've invested on the Belt and Road without ever saying the words Belt and Road in the same sentence, right? They did it for a reason. He did it for a reason, right? I'm sure he was trying to associate himself with a big project and strategically signal to the rest of the world, this is where we are. But if that's what he did, then the rest of the world looked at where they were and thought, quite a lot of people said, we don't like where you are now. So I do think it was, people would have noticed at some point that China was doing all this investment, right? I'm not saying that, but I do wonder whether he's oversold China a little bit.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Hita, please, and then the last one, Johnny, and we end the first round of questions from here.
Sure.
Hi, Professor Breslin. Thank you so much for your. I really enjoyed what you said last about Chinese imaginary power as a source of power, because I think that's a great problem that we have in Chinese studies. We don't try to understand its past and all its culture and philosophy and it's history, really. So we are always trying to understand what China is going to do without actually explaining what it did in the past. So my question is, it's more about a topic that I am investigating in my thesis. That's the environmental global policy. And I would like to know your views on how China is dealing with this renewable energy sources and the impact of a world that seeks to depend less and less on fossil fuels, such as oil, coal, and how this concept of eco-civilization can impact Chinese foreign policy.
Thanks for that, Rita. Just before I go on to your question, it gets to the point where anything that you say, I mean, you say, but look how far China has come, right? You look how far China has come to sort of accommodate itself into the existing global order. And the response you get is just wait, just wait until it has to. David Kang complained about this. Everywhere that he would go and give lectures, and he would say, actually, China's changed more than the world has changed. And people would say, just wait, when it really has the power. And he can't win, right? You can't prove it because it's all sort of predicated upon the future. But I certainly think it's true that, in fact, you can go back and find a document written by George Osborne and Jim O'Neill that were justifying the golden age of UK policy toward China on what China would become in the next 20, 30 years. It's very interesting. On environmental policy, yeah, I mean, I have a little bit of a credit where credit's due. There have been incredible changes within China, and policies have been brought in place that have made a change. But to claim the victory of ecological civilization yet, and I know you didn't, but as some people in China do seem to do, I think he's pushing things a little bit too far. I mean, the whole point about ecological civilization is that this isn't just about introducing more environmentally sound policies into the existing paradigm. It's about a new paradigm, right? The whole thing about ecological civilization is this is meant to be a fundamentally different paradigm where the ecology is front and center. And the reality is that what's happened is things have stopped getting worse as bad as they otherwise would have done. And if you look at the amount of coal that is being used within China, for example, the rate of increase slowed down dramatically, although it might have actually gone back up again last year. But it's not got as bad as it would have done as quickly as it would have done, but it's not the end of the problem just yet. There is still quite a long way to go. So I applaud the actions that have been taken. I applaud the firm recognition. One of the key things is that local officials in China have to sign this contract. It's called a contract responsibility system. And it has a series of things that they have to do. And there are various targets, and some of them are called veto targets. And a veto target means if you don't hit that target, then it doesn't matter what you do and everything else, you're said to have failed. So the one-child policy, officials would be set a birth rate increase within their area. That was a veto target. You might increase GDP by 12% or whatever, but if you didn't hit that target, that was you failed. You did not make your contract. So promotion was a problem. And in, I think it was 2017, environmental targets were written into these contracts for the first time as veto targets, and I think that is very significant. But I think there is still this tension. There's a really interesting tension that runs through policy making in China. There's a couple of them. One is the desire to unleash, but then the concern about what happens when you unleash. So let's liberalize, but no, don't do that. Don't. We'll liberalize the investment regime, but don't invest over there. We didn't mean you to do that. And the other one is this recognition that there needs to be an even more significant change in the nature of economic activity than there has been to date, both for environmental sustainabilities, but also for economic sustainability reasons, right? But this concern that doing so might lead to growth in unemployment and social dislocations that might then challenge the nature of authoritarian rule. And we've seen it time and time again, even over the past years, that steps will be taken to sort of stop a certain type of economic activity, but then when it threatens employment, often then there's a step back again. So I'm not sure. I mean, the figures that we've got are that the increase in coal mines from China in, I think it's the past 4 years, are more than the savings in the rest of the world put together. So the rate of increase in China, even though that line is shallower, offsets the savings that have been made by the reduction in coal in other parts of the world. So there's still a way to go. But one thing is for sure, I think, and I've been involved a little bit in some of the preparations for the COP summit in Glasgow this year, is that if there are going to be effective global solutions to environmental problems, China has to be part of that answer rather than part of the problem. And the good news, I think, is that there is a keen desire within China itself and within Xi Jinping to be seen to be a global leader when it comes to the environment. So things are not getting bad as quickly as they were. In some areas, they're actually improving. I was in Beijing during the apocalypse of 2013, where, I mean, if you look across to the nearest wall, any of you wouldn't have been able to see that wall because of the pollution. We had bad sandstorms a couple of weeks ago, but in general, some of those really awful things are improving. But we need to just sort of take a little bit of a step back and say, well done where things have changed. Still not finished yet, but I think encouraging China and applauding China if and when it does act as a responsible global leader on the environment is exactly the right thing to do. And it comes back to the question that Shaun asked before. How can you separate out China as a systemic rival, but you know that it's an essential partner when it comes to any chance of building effective environmental governance in the world, right? So these are all important. Here's a question that I will pose rhetorically. What global issue, what deficit in global governance at the moment can be dealt with without China's participation effectively? There's a little question to throw in, a little grenade to throw into the discussion at this point, I think. So, I mean, actually, Rita, I mean, I haven't written on the environment for a long time, but I do a lecture on the political economy of the environment that focuses on ecological civilization. And if you want to get access to those lecture notes, and because I've recorded them this year, the video, I don't know how I would do the video, but I could certainly drop you the slides. So just get in touch with me by email and I'll see what I can do, if that's useful.
Thank you, Johnny. It's your turn, please.
Where's Johnny on my screen?
Everyone.
Oh, Johnny's there.
Doctoral student in international relations at University of São Paulo. And thank you, Professor Breslin, for your speech. Very nice. And my question to you is, domestically, we understand that China has several challenges, I would say threats also, such as considerable income inequality. I mean, if you compare the East Coast and the rest of its territory, there is a potential social unrest if we look at religious issues and also the Hong Kong issue. Fuel and water shortage, if we consider the size of its economy and its military capacity, and also food security for the size of its in your opinion, what would be the most critical challenge or threat for China for its grand strategy?
Thanks, John. Good question. I mean, the first thing to say is that what you say is one of the reasons why I think there is a lot more insecurity at the heart of Chinese grand strategy than perhaps is sometimes appreciated, and concerns about how to get and maintain, for example, supplies of oil and other resources loom very, very large in considerations of policymakers. You know, there's quite a dependence on stuff that goes through that there Straits of Malacca. I mean, if you have, I don't know whether people have been to Singapore and just stood on the beach at Sentosa and just watched the oil tankers going past you. There goes the global economy in front of your eyes as you go along. I think there are short-term and longer-term challenges that have been identified. I think the short-term one is there is concern about social instability. I mean, I'm not so sure it's the regional inequality as more obvious inequalities, because even in, you know, I was in Beijing a couple of years ago and went to a place where migrant workers were, it was a black hospital, they called it, where migrant workers who'd been injured were being treated by effectively migrant workers who'd been there a bit longer. It was about 1.5 miles away from the central business district, you know. A couple of miles away from Sanlitun, where on a Friday night you can probably see more Porsches and sort of Alfa Romeos than anywhere else. And yet these people were not protected by the state that was basically giving them really crap money to work in terrible conditions. But there is concern about unemployment and the growth of unemployment, and particularly I mean, if you go out of the big cities, you can go to some of these cities in China that are, what, 2-3 million people. And they're effectively one firm towns. It might not be that everybody works for the one plant, but they'll be working for part of the ecosystem of that plant. And if they go bust, then the overall impact on the overall unemployment figure won't be massive, but locally it'll be huge and significant. So I think that's the short-term concern that people have got, that as they make this transition, it's unemployment and perhaps the lack of a really effective social welfare safety net that people really trust to pick up the pieces as the changes go by. The other thing that is absolutely very important, short, medium term, is debt. I mean, it is just astonishing. The amount of debt held, particularly at the local government level in China, is enormous. I mean, it's actually quite difficult to know the full amount of it because of the way that these things, but a number of local governments are effectively bankrupt. They're issuing more, and they're now allowing more local governments to issue more bonds, basically to pay off the debt by taking on more debt. You have property bubbles in China, which are astonishing. Now, Maria, you've been to Kenilworth. I don't know whether you've been to Kenilworth. I mean, so I live in a nice leafy part of Middle England, right? Nice garden. Garden's what? 30 metres garden. It's quite nice out there. 4-bedroom, 2 bathrooms, ensuite, and things like that. If I sold this house here, the only thing I could buy in Beijing would be a 1-room bedsit around the 5th Ring Road, if that means anything to people who know China. So quite a long way out of the city centre. I was in Shanghai, actually, when the coronavirus was breaking out. And I was looking at property near Fudan University, and the cheapest property I could find was a 1-bedroom flat near the university, which would cost about 470,000 euros. Right? And yet, in other parts of the country, you've got vast amounts of property sitting empty. You know, it's been built and it's just sitting empty. So you've got bubbles and oversupply. You've got massive debt in the system. You're still going through a system of sort of investment-led growth. Now, should we worry about it? Partly yes, because, I mean, it looks unsustainable. Partly no, because actually the financial system looked worse in 1997 than it does today in some respects and didn't go bankrupt then. But just because it didn't go bankrupt in the past doesn't mean that it won't happen in the future. So finance, deleverage, and if you read through the tea leaves, if you like, of the government work report for the National People's Congress, you'll find that they're worried about debt as well, and particularly local government debt and how they get out of this in the medium term while still growing. In the longer term, I think you hit your nail on the head when you said water. I think that's a really interesting problem that the Chinese government is going to have to, well, I don't know how, but face and deal with at some point within the future. So I would say unemployment, debt, finance, local government finance. It's not very exciting. It's not very sexy, right? But the single biggest source of income for local governments that they control themselves is selling land use rights. Not selling the land, but selling the rights because local governments maintain. And that's crazy. I mean, that's an incentive for the price to keep going up and up and up and create more bubbles. In the long term, I think food insecurity and all the other things that kick off from spillover from water issues. I mean, the water situation in northern China already now is dire. There's no signs that it's going to get any better anytime soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Breslin. We have lots of questions from people watching through YouTube. Okay. And since we have like more 10 minutes to talk about China, I will join some questions. And I think that one of the major issue here is the relation between China and Latin America. There are questions about the recent Chinese diplomat increased their relationship with Colombia. There are questions if the influence over Latin America, China's influence over Latin America can be different from the US approach. considering that China is passed as a colony on the 19th century? And more generally, there is a question if whether there are different, maybe clashing different preferences in China regarding its foreign policy towards second-tier states, like small states like South Africa, Indonesia, South Korea, and we can think about Brazil and a lot of countries in Latin America. So maybe you can put them together and talk a little bit about the relationship between China and Latin America. That
yeah, I mean, I really don't know much about China and Latin America. I mean, I don't claim any sort of expertise at all, or on Africa. This is why I started off saying this is very much a perspective from Europeans. Sort of in Europe, he spends more of his time in China. But I do know a little bit about the aims and objectives, and certainly the aim and objective is to project China as a very different type of economic and political partner than the United States. It's a very real, clear attempt to establish that China is a very different type of great power that will engage other developing states in a very different way, the antithesis almost to the United States. China wants to be seen as being the the US, right? So not having a normative position in some ways becomes a normative position in itself if other countries have a normative position. So China's normative position is, unlike them, we don't have a normative position, which becomes a self-identity and a nation branding. And I think this is at the core of a lot of what has been done. That said, the debate in China shifted quite a bit after China got its financial fingers burnt in Venezuela. And I think some of the enthusiasm for financial deals that might be seen to be politically sort of beneficial was lost, right? People began to focus more on the money and what was the consequences of perhaps, again, a bit of a exuberance in terms of financial relationships. So I think, again, what it is it's this attempt to neutralize the authority of the existing powers, not to sort of take it on, to sort of head on sort of antagonism, but I do think that there is an attempt to undermine the authority, undermine the legitimacy, undermine the economic rationality, undermine the forcefulness of the existing powers relations with not just Latin America, but I think the same goes with the developing other parts of the world more generally. I mean, it's quite clear, I think, if you look at in the Caribbean, there's an attempt not really to sort of directly confront the US, but to sort of just chip away and make sort of China look like that sort of. In terms of relations, policy competition, I mean, the slogan is that, you know, the great powers are the key point. Relationships with the region are the bedrock, really, and then you build on relations with developing countries. Now, there are developing countries, of course, within China's region as well, and this is where it's not so much a policy competition, but 2 or 3 different contending considerations come into play. One is this idea of promoting China as a different type of great power that lends money without political strings attached, no conditionalities, win-win scenarios, and then there's core interests. And for those countries where China's core interests come up against the core interests of other developing economies, then we have tension, right? So with Indonesia, there is tension. There's tension over, actually partly to do with the ethnic Chinese population of Indonesia, but over Chinese fishing fleets going into Indonesian water. With Vietnam, there's a clearer tension in terms of, well, they went to war in 1979, and if you go to Hanoi and talk about China, then you will find that it doesn't take long for that historical memory to come out again. India, I think, is a fascinating one. I went to Delhi and did a tour of some of the research institutions working on China to get a feeling of that. And the conversation starts off about South-South solidarity, challenging the hegemony of the West, shared resistance to Western hegemony, shared concern with the distribution of power in the global order, a shared position on global governance reform. And then it takes about 2 minutes to come around to the China security challenge to India. either the direct security challenge on the disputed border, or actually more often China's support for Pakistan and what that means for the Pakistan-India cleavage. And so, I mean, I think the cleavage or the difference doesn't really come from internal debates over policy with those parts of the world. In fact, there's not a huge amount of knowledge and background knowledge about large parts of the world. The Chinese research institutions are dominated by people working on the United States, on Japan, and the rest of the region. I remember talking to one guy in African studies. He said, I've been asked to write a report on Egypt. He said, not only have I never been to Egypt, I've never been to North Africa at all. He said, I work on Zambia. But the difference tends to come from this clash between what we might call world order sort of positions and political economy positions on the one hand, and territory and core interest positions. And if a country has an ambivalent position where it's both a developing economy but also has core interest sort of challenges with China, that's where policy can sort of, I think, fluctuate and vacillate. But also, for most relations with most countries, that country's relationship with the United States is an important conditioner. So if you look at relations, the way that China sees Turkey, well, it often really depends on how Turkey at that point is dealing with the United States and dealing with the European Union. So that country's relationship with the US and the other great powers is often a determinant of how China approaches it and deals with it. But I'm no Latin America specialist by any stretch, and I would not claim. Carol Wise is the woman to ask to come down and have or Kevin Gallagher.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Breslin. We are running out of time, and we would stay here for another 3 or 4 hours asking everything we want to know about China.
I can't stay 3 or 4 hours, but I can stay a bit longer. I have nothing till 4 o'clock as it happens. But
yeah, then we might have some time if, since Professor Breslin said that he's willing to stay a little more with us. So, Pedro Dalari, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Breslin, for your very interesting lecture. I'm a professor of international law and study human rights and human rights law. And about what you said about China is not very enthusiastic in adopting the liberal global order perspective based on human rights, I would like to listen you a little bit about what your perspective about Hong Kong and the problems in Hong Kong that deal exactly with this conflict between human rights values and this perspective, this Chinese perspective of the exercise of authority. What can we expect about Hong Kong? Tiananmen Square massacre, repetition of the massacre of 1989. What is your perspective?
Thanks, Pedro. I mean, human rights is, I think, a fascinating area. I did actually co-author a report for Chatham House a few years ago on China and the international human rights regime, because it's one of the areas where the Chinese authorities have been more confident in proposing Chinese understandings and Chinese norms as the basis for international discussions and international agreement. So as I'm sure you know, China has been very active in the Human Rights Council, and it's managed to get its understanding and the wording of a community of common destiny written into a number of documents and resolutions now. And basically this is an understanding that says each country has the right to define human rights the way it wants to, right? That each country is, it means that there is no global governance, because the highest level of authority, as far as the Chinese see it, is the nation state, and each nation state has the right to define not just human rights but human security nationally. So what human rights means is different based on the individual national setting and condition, which, as far as I can see, means that you end up with a normative anarchy, right? Because every country has its own definition an understanding, and there is no sort of benchmark, or if there is a benchmark, it's so thin that it really doesn't count for very much. So Hong Kong, I mean, I spent quite a bit of time in Hong Kong over the years. It's still one of my favorite places in the world, and with the exception of Denmark, it was the last place I managed to be before the lockdown. I thought I'd escaped the pandemic. I flew, I think it was the 22nd of January, I flew from Shanghai to Hong Kong, and Wuhan was closed down on the 23rd of January, and I thought, wow, I've escaped the pandemic. You know, how wrong I was. And actually, I had been there twice during the demonstrations the previous year. And I'm afraid that it was always clear to me that not the second or the first demonstration, but when it was day 3 or day 4 or day 5 of the demonstration, without any sign of it stopping, I thought it was pretty obvious that something was going to happen which reinforced Beijing's position on Hong Kong. What I didn't expect was for it to be what has happened, and I think this has taken a lot of people by surprise. So, you know, we were expecting rain, and what we've had is a monsoon and downpour rather than the rain that we were expecting. And now we're in a situation where basically the entire political system of Hong Kong has been overturned, right? I mean, there's no other way of thinking about it other than that. And it comes back to this confidence. I mean, did Xi Jinping think that they could maybe do this while everybody else was worried about the pandemic and people wouldn't respond as much? I don't know. I think it would have come anyway, and it's partly because the National People's Congress was delayed. But they're not going to back down. There's going to be no backing down on this from Beijing. There is going to be. I remember I was really lucky. I was at the umbrella demonstrations. What year was that? 2013. I was there on the last day of that, and for reasons I won't go into, I ended up talking to the chief of police in Hong Kong, and he said this isn't going to go away because the younger generation, and he said the older generation is split 50-50, pro Beijing or not so pro. He said the younger generation are pretty much 80-20, 90-10, anti being controlled by Beijing. So I don't see any resolution to this other than I don't think it'll end up with 1989 style violence, but you know, you wouldn't say never. It depends whether people find alternative ways. Lots of people looking to Canada, for example. A lot of those people who had bought property in Canada over the last sort of 10, 20 years now thinking it was a good idea, and sort of, I think it could lead to the decline of Hong Kong as the sort of global financial center in the way it is. And it's really shaken a lot of people. And maybe this is a particularly UK perspective, right? But there was a sort of feeling in the UK that the deal had been signed, you know, the basic law was in place, and that you stick with that, you know. You play cricket, you play by the rules, you play the score, and this stays in place. And the fact that it hasn't has led, I know, a number of people who had previously been a little bit more prepared to accommodate China, shall we put it that way, now changing their mind about China. But, you know, there's going to be no back down from this. This is about creating Hong Kong in China's image rather than the other way around, as I think a lot of UK policymakers thought in 1984 or 1985 that China would change the Hong Kong image. It's about the other way around. I think, you know, hate to say it, but the bigger question might be, where does this leave the relationship between PRC and Taiwan in the long term? Because, you know, this is one thing we can be sure about. This hasn't made the prospect of one country, two systems more attractive for anybody in Taiwan, I don't think, over there. So I think more of the same, doubling down. We've seen what's happened with the sanctioning on Xinjiang. BBC have been in trouble about what's happened in Hong Kong. China Global Television News was sanctioned by the regulators in Britain for the way that they reported Hong Kong issues, and then there was reciprocal complaints about the BBC back in China. I'm meant to be going in December, pandemic willing. Let's see, because one of the things about the national security law is that it applies to anybody at any time in any place. So any person, one of you now on this screen, says something that is deemed to be detrimental about China, and at some point in the future you go to Hong Kong, you could be subject to the national security law and detained. Extraterritorial control. Question is, how does a liberal world cope with a big, giant illiberal actor within the middle of it? And so far, I don't think anybody knows the answer. That's no answer to your question, Pedro, I'm afraid. But I just think more of the same, basically.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Breslin.
Thank you.
Yeah, my connection is not very good, but I hope you were listening.
Yes.
At least. Yes, thanks. I will finish with 2 questions from the YouTube audience, and then you can choose which one you are going to answer, or if you can just mismatch them and answer both. And Andrea Longobardi asks, do you think this futurology is related to the weight that propaganda has for the Chinese government strategies, like a not critical response or reaction to this propaganda? And Victor has a very different questions, but he would like to ask if exploring the argument about the plurality of interest that goes into the Chinese foreign policy making, how much constitutional practical autonomy the province and their main corporations have to do with paradiplomacy. Here are the last 2 questions.
Okay, I mean, they're both very good questions. I mean, really good questions. I think on the futurology, I mean, in some respects, I think the problem isn't the future, it's the past, right? I think too much scholarship is still embedded in the Cold War and the previous period of bipolarity. And there's an expectation, I think, and particularly in North America, I think because of the dichotomization of theoretical preferences to either liberalism or realism, and because of the Cold War, we too quickly go, well, that scholarship too quickly goes back to look for the future, right? I think I hear what you're saying about the Chinese propaganda system, but I think in the academic scholarship and policy-making scholarship, I think that's more of an issue, that there's an expectation that we're going back to where we were before. And the amount of times you read things written in American IR on China that starts with Mearsheimer versus Eichenberry, Mearsheimer versus Eichenberry. I mean, it drives me insane, you know. It's as if constructivism didn't exist, or critical theory didn't exist, or political economy didn't exist, because, you know, many of the things that those of us who like to think of ourselves as being in the IPE sort of community sort of take for granted, just sort of questions that aren't even really thought of and considered and discussed. The idea that international economics is still done between nations, 2 nations, you know, with a win-win, you know, zero-sum games, it's just astonishing. So I would put it down to the paucity of theoretical sort of scholarship and thinking, and a tendency from both of those main theoretical positions, I think, to look to the past for your futures rather than anything else. Maybe that's unfair, but it's near the end of the session, so I can be unfair, and nobody has the time to come back and criticise me. On the second question, in terms of paradiplomacy, I mean, there are constraints, right? There are overarching constraints. If you tried to do things like deal with a country that recognised Taiwan without the approval of the central government, then there would be trouble, right? You need permissions for things like that. But from about 2006 onward, and certainly in 2010 and 11, it was made much, much, much more easy for these companies to operate through not getting permission from the National Development Reform Commission, the old state council, but first of all, simply reporting what they were doing. And provincial authorities have been given the authority to oversee most of the projects, right? I mean, very few of them, I think, is in unstable countries, in risky areas, and there are certain categories of investment in certain sectors that have to be approved by the centre. So basically, if a company, let's say in Yunnan or Sichuan, wants to invest in Myanmar or Laos or Cambodia, it can pretty much do these things as it sees fit, as long as it's got the money to do it, as long as it can get the finances, which often they can. And so they have considerable economic autonomy. I mean, how political is this? In some respects, depends on your view of international politics and international relations. I'm sure those companies and those local governments, when they're, let's say, investing in a project in Cambodia, think that they're undertaking a commercial operation designed to make money, perhaps designed to export excess capacity. But the way that they are then understood and perceived by people looking at them are that this is part of China's influence spreading across the world. And it's so, I mean, I guess it depends whether you're a constructivist or not, or your particular take on international relations, whether it is just straightforward economic relations or whether it can constitute some form of power diplomacy. But yeah, they have considerable autonomy. And if you look, there was a report that came out from the NDRC, National Development Reform Commission, a couple of years ago. I think it's only in Chinese though, that traces the changes in China's overseas foreign direct investment from 2002 to whatever year it was. I think it's 2017. I've got it referenced in the book, so I can, if people are interested, I can send them that. And one of the things that comes out of that was that in 2000 and early 2000s, central state-owned enterprises were accounting for something like 70-80% of all Chinese outward investment. And now it's in the minority, and it's private and local enterprises that dominate. Now, this doesn't mean that they have full autonomy, because as the example of what happened in 2016-17 shows, the state can step in and go no. But this is the way that the Chinese economy works. You know, the state creates the parameters and the boundaries of activity, and as long as you then operate within those boundaries and don't do things that upset the state, then you can do things. So there's, you know, the market actors can act within the Chinese economy as long as in the process they're not doing damaging things. But the threshold of, if we might call it this, market failure is relatively low. So the point at which the state steps in and says, no, you can't do that, either temporarily or permanently, is perhaps much lower it is in China than it is in other countries. And we do see that. So you have considerable autonomy until you don't, which often makes it really difficult, because what you were doing was entirely legitimate at the time, and then ex post facto becomes illegitimate. And that can be a bit of a problem for any type of Chinese actor. So, yeah, they do have considerable autonomy to act. But bear in mind, we're talking about, I mean, Shandong province is, what, 100 and something million now? I mean, Guangdong is, 18, 90 million. Well, one of the things that I think is really interesting is the way that in the 80s, I wrote my PhD on center-province relations in China. If I was doing it now, I would be looking at the autonomy of prefectures and counties and townships as autonomous actors, even below the province. And so to sit in Beijing, in Zhongnanhai, and know what, I don't know, Z County in Guizhou is doing in terms of its local company investing in Laos, I mean, you probably don't even know. It's what's really interesting. The figures that the Chinese give for investment into Outer Mongolia are tiny compared to the figures that Mongolia says that it's actually received from China. It's really quite fascinating. It suggests that the Chinese authorities don't always know everything that's happening. I think, and Joanna, that'll probably do.
Okay. Once again, thank you very much, Professor Breslin, for joining us this morning, your afternoon, and exploring all our issues and questions, and exploring all your knowledge to give us some view from China and understanding better what's going on. I think that here in Brazil, we still studying China, and we are getting there, but it's very important to listen from someone that's studying China for such a long time and to understand the domestic policies and the domestic part of China, that it's usually not there in the scholarship that we have access to. So
well, that's very kind of you said, but you must remember that I'm very much, influenced by the location and the political debates of where I am, right? So the way that I view China just simply is influenced by the fact that I'm a white male European who works in Europe and within China. And it's a story of somebody studying China, but there are many, many others that would look very differently from people who are in different parts of the world with different experiences. Right?
Yeah, but thank you very much for sharing your story with us. I think it's not a very common story that we are usually listening to, so it's very interesting.
Your sort of not quite neighbour a little bit further north sort of tends to dominate, I think, a lot of things. Well, look, I mean, if anybody wants, I think I can't remember who it was I said to, was it Richard, that I have the lecture that I could send her on the environment. I mean, I'm easy to find online. If you want anything, let me know. And one day I might even tell you the story of how I went to see Wham become the first pop band to play in China in 1985. Because, my word, that's a story to be told, but not perhaps in a public environment.
Okay, and thank you. Maybe we can join together later in this year or next year. And we learned with this pandemic that we can make conversation through YouTube and Google Meet. So maybe we won't have much money to bring you here in Brazil, but we can use this new technology to have this very interesting conversation.
Be very careful, because as editor of the Pacific Review, I do have a budget to try and spread the readership of the journal in parts of the world where we don't have particularly high subscriptions. So given that there is a conference or two in the US every year that I tend to go to, you never know, if you say that too often, you might find that I'm sitting in one of your offices before too long rather than on the other end of a screen.
It would be great to have you around. I think that everybody here will join me in offering cafezinho or pão de queijo and something good to eat and drink from here.
Caipirinha, Professor Adriana. Caipirinha is better.
Okay, I'll trust the experts.
Okay, so thank you, everybody. I would like another time to thank Reinaldo, it's our IT employee that make this room today with in a local holiday because of the pandemic. So thank you all from here, the Google Meet room, and from the YouTube audience. And once again, thank you very much.
Bye-bye, everybody. Take care.
I have to say that I bought your book already.
Oh, fantastic. That's I think 20 pence worth of
you get extra points.
See you soon, hopefully. Take care, everybody.
Yeah.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.